Does monasticism have a future? I visited a monastery for the first time 11 years ago. Until that point, I thought monasticism was an ancient or medieval phenomenon. It was a thing of the past as far as I was concerned. Well, I was in for a surprise. Not only are there still monks in the 21st century, but on the very day I saw this for myself, I decided I wanted to be one. Except I was 22, and looking around the monastic choir, I realized that the youngest person there was over twice my age, and most of the monks were over 3 times my age, and there were even some monks over 4 times my age. After a 90-year-old monk terrified me with something I couldn't understand about monastic life being all about being humiliated, it wasn't clear to me that I would be able to connect with these older men, or that the monastery would even still be around when I was their age. You might call this my personal introduction to the vocations crisis. I did finally work up the courage to join a monastery, but unfortunately, it didn't take long before I had a personal introduction to the sex abuse crisis. And while I did profess temporary vows for 3 years in a Benedictine monastery, when it came time to consider a perpetual commitment to the community, I couldn't make that commitment in good conscience. Partly the timing was bad. This was right in the wake of the Pennsylvania grand jury report and the revelations about former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's sexual improprieties, about which, at least at the time of this recording, the Vatican has yet to release its report. The idea of committing my life to a monastic institution that was still coming to terms with its own history of sexual misconduct was and continues to be rather unpalatable to me. But I also had the sense that committing my life to that monastery meant committing my life to maintaining a massive structure that had become unsustainable. This seemed incompatible with the contemplative life that I feel called to. You could say that I just didn't see a future for myself there. So here I am now, asking the same question I've been asking since I first visited a monastery 11 years ago. Does monasticism have a future? Now, I want to be clear about something from the start. I sure hope it does. I still want to be a professed monk living a relatively traditional monastic life in terms of monastic practices like liturgical prayer, lectio divina, community, solitude, manual labor, silence, and so on. But in order to do that, I really need to see a vision for the future that acknowledges the challenges monasticism is facing and offers a way beyond these challenges for the next generation, my generation, to live an authentic monastic life in obedience to the gospel in the 21st century. Before we jump in, I want to ask you to think about how you're approaching this question. How do you feel about the ambiguity this question points to about contemporary monastic experience? An ambiguity not unlike that of this photo. Can you tell? Is it a sunrise or a sunset? Where do you suspect monastic life is heading in our time? Is it setting, slipping past the horizon, beyond our vision? Or is it rising on a new day? The signs of the times are themselves ambiguous here. We're going to be looking at 4 today, 2 which call the future of monasticism into question, and 2 more hopeful signs of the times which keep me asking the question. Then I'll offer some reflections on the intrinsic value of the monastic search for God in response to these signs of the times, and finally, some brief sketches about what the future might actually look like. The most obvious place to start is the vocations crisis I mentioned earlier. Monasteries and other religious communities have experienced fairly dramatic decreases in personnel over the last 50 years or so. Communities that used to have large numbers of perpetually professed members now find themselves with half or even a quarter as many members, many of them elderly. On the one hand, this may not be as much of a crisis as we think. The large numbers of religious in the 50s and 60s are probably an historical anomaly. We're likely returning to more normal numbers of religious as a percentage of practicing Catholics overall. On the other hand, these dramatic decreases in personnel have created a real crisis for religious communities that continue to live in the same facilities and take care of many of the same apostolates as they did when they had larger numbers. The Retirement Fund for Religious notes that by 2029, retired religious are projected to outnumber wage earners by nearly 3-1. This raises the obvious question of the sustainability of these communities. Some will close, but even for the monasteries that stay open, the changes this situation calls for may be dramatic and perhaps even traumatic for people who joined the monastery in an earlier era. But we are in a new era, and the social conditions which supported large monastic communities capable of founding schools and hospitals like the Benedictines of the 20th century simply do not exist anymore. While it is a blessing that the Benedictines were able to respond to the need for schools and hospitals as generously as they did, we must remember that, unlike some other Catholic religious communities, Benedictine monasteries aren't founded for the sake of any apostolate or any other extrinsic value. That is, they don't exist for something they do for you or something they can get for you. They exist to support the monastic life itself. So when I wonder about the future of monasticism, I'm not particularly interested in whether monasteries will continue to sponsor large institutions like schools and hospitals. We need to respond to the needs of our own time, not the needs of the 20th century. And even more importantly, we need to see that monasticism has its own intrinsic value in its search for God. Now, monastic institutions are not alone in having their future questioned like this. Given what scientists are saying about the environmental crisis we're facing, it's not particularly radical for me to say that the future of the planet itself is radically being called into question right now. Pollution, climate change, shortages of fresh water, loss of biodiversity, and the social and economic effects of these environmental issues led Pope Francis to say in his important encyclical letter, Laudato Si, aside from all doomsday predictions, the present world system is certainly unsustainable from a number of points of view, for we have stopped thinking about the goals of human activity. Here too we can make a distinction between extrinsic value and intrinsic value. You might say that we've got ourselves into the environmental crisis by focusing on the extrinsic value of the environment, particularly its value to a global capitalist economy, at the expense of its intrinsic value as created by God. This is the reverse of Pope Francis' message in Laudato Si, where he said, quoting the German bishops, "Where other creatures are concerned, we can speak of the priority of being over that of being useful. We are being called, as members of the Church and as inhabitants of this planet, to reevaluate our way of life and our relationships with creation. This should encourage monasteries to face their own issues of sustainability with renewed attention to intrinsic values." While the vocations crisis and the environmental crisis are probably the most obvious and most dramatic of the crises facing monasticism today, they are certainly not the only ones. But we're not going to go any further than that today. I'll just say that amid all this uncertainty, one thing is clear. If monasticism has a future, it's going to look different than what we got used to in the 20th century. there are nevertheless signs of hope. Interest in monastic spirituality has exploded in recent years. While monasteries may not have as many professed members, they have more oblates than ever. Many monasteries have strong oblate programs, where oblates aren't just friends of the monastery, but take their formation, their commitment to Benedictine spirituality, and their connection to their monastery of oblation quite seriously. Even as social conditions have changed, there is clearly still support for monasticism. Many people outside of monasteries understand the intrinsic value of monastic life. I think Oblate Jeanette Kelly said it very well when she said that the rule and the community provide challenge, encouragement, and wisdom in my seeking God and being Christ to others. That's exactly what monasticism is about, seeking God and being Christ to others. I'm also quite encouraged by the Oblates for the Future Symposium, hosted at the Monastery of St. Gertrude in Cottonwood, Idaho. If I don't focus on Oblates as much in this talk as I do on other topics, it's because so much has already been said in talks from these symposiums that you can find on St. Gertrude's YouTube channel. I'll include a link in the description below. There is just one thing I want to point out here. I don't really see any more people my age here in this picture than I do in most monastic choirs. So you might be surprised to hear me say that I find hope for the future of monasticism in the millennial generation. Just don't be too surprised. If we're not able to find hope in future generations, we might as well give up on a future for monasticism. It's crucial that the monastic tradition is passed along to my generation. So please, take this opportunity to learn a little bit about where we're coming from. This is more like it. Before I get into this, though, I do want to say something about the generational divide within the Catholic Church. Before anyone says that younger Catholics are all ultra-conservative and rigid, please read the final document from the meeting with young people, which took place before the Synod on Young People hosted by the Vatican within the last couple years. Since this document was actually produced by young people, it provides a good starting point for trying to understand what and how young people actually think. And it might surprise those who look down on younger Catholics. I'll put a link in the description. The more concerning divide in the Catholic Church is that between those who question the legitimacy of Pope Francis and those who hear in his teaching the call of the gospel. That divide is not generational. So while there is a generational divide that is significant to the question about the future of monasticism, I'm not going to bridge that gap in this talk. So let's look at just one attempt to bridge this gap that gives me some hope. I don't quite fit into the category of so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those with no religious affiliation, but I might have. I can think of a lot of good reasons why people might drop their religious affiliations. For some in my generation, we weren't raised in religious traditions because a religious institution let our parents down. For example, our parents might have been told that they weren't welcome at church because they were divorced, or they might have been told that their miscarriage must be connected to some big sin in their lives. For others, we were let down by a religious institution firsthand. So, for example, let's say a pastor fired someone we actually connected with on staff to fix the church finances, and then went out and bought a fancy new car. Or that the same pastor was having an affair with a married woman from the congregation, a friend's mother. All these examples are real, by the way. I know them all first or second hand, and all of this before I encountered sexual misconduct, past and present, in multiple monastic communities. Trust has been broken. Frankly, instead of wondering why other people in my generation are dropping their religious affiliations, I sometimes wonder why I haven't dropped mine. What the category nuns misses, though, is that many people who drop their religious affiliations nevertheless continue to have an interest in spirituality. I would argue a more accurate name for this group is seekers, since having been disillusioned by a religious institution, they nevertheless continue the spiritual quest. In a surprising twist of expectations, this might make us millennials good candidates for monastic life, since St. Benedict's number one criteria is that the candidate is seeking God. Indeed, having himself been disillusioned by life in Rome, St. Benedict could be a fitting patron saint for the millennial generation, disillusioned not only by religious institutions, but also by an economy that won't work for us, and political institutions that fail to address the crises of our day. Many of us are struggling to find meaning in a world shaped overwhelmingly by the extrinsic values of fame, fortune, success, and power. Monasteries should be offering us the meaning we're looking for in the intrinsic values promoted by monastic life. Values like community, simplicity, satisfaction with one's work, and prayer. The Nuns and Nuns initiative is having some success here. Through Nuns and Nuns, a younger generation of seekers has found deep resonance with Sisters' work, way of life, and charisms, the defining values that shape their call as a community. Amidst the social and environmental crises of our times, we are hearing a common call to incubate new forms of community rooted in love and committed to justice. That section in bold is their emphasis, not mine. I wonder, are we willing to respond to this call? By way of transition to a response to these signs of the times, I want to share a couple of quotes from Thomas Merton's final lecture before he died. He uses gendered language, but I suspect his intention was inclusive. The monk is essentially someone who takes up a critical attitude towards the world and its structures. If one is to call himself in one way or another a monk, he must have in some way or other reached some kind of critical conclusion about the validity of certain claims made by secular society and its structures with regard to the end of man's existence. In other words, the monk is somebody who says, in one way or another, that the claims of the world are fraudulent. Hey, kind of sounds like a millennial to me. I would suggest you remember this for the future. From now on, everybody stands on his own feet. This, I think, is what Buddhism is about, what Christianity is about, what monasticism is about, if you understand it in terms of grace. We can no longer rely on being supported by structures which may be destroyed at any moment by a political power, a political force. You cannot rely on structures. As I was putting this presentation together, I realized there were many directions I could go from here. Initially, I wanted to get into all the nitty-gritty of how the early monastic tradition offers all sorts of resources for a renewal of monasticism in response to the challenges of our times. Then I thought maybe I'd skip my thought process and instead go straight into some concrete ideas about what the monasteries of the future might actually look like. But I think Merton was onto something here. We need a more personal approach rather than the structural approach, which was my first instinct. Don't get me wrong, structures play a role, but I want the structures to follow the renewal of monastic life, not monastic life to follow the renewal of structures. So, what would it mean to stand on our own feet? I think it means, first of all, that we choose decisively to live for a different end than that which the world has fraudulently claimed for us. Namely, that we find our happiness in production and consumption within the market economy. Look at the remarkable similarity between what Merton said in his last lecture and what Pope Francis said in Laudato Si. Is this not the root of the ecological crisis? The false claims of an all-encompassing economy about which Margaret Thatcher famously said, "There is no alternative"? Millennials are certainly caught up in this, but I've got reason to believe many of us have been disillusioned by these structures. So, to what extent have monasteries bought into the present world system? To what extent have monastics become spiritual managers of a bourgeois society, chaplains of the status quo, or even just workers caught up in the extrinsic value system proposed or really dictated by our economic structures? Or more importantly, to what extent does our vision for the future of monasticism continue to be informed by these claims? Monasticism must provide an alternative where there is none, or at least where just about everything in our society conspires to suppress our ability to imagine alternatives. But what true end could claim us in a way that we could actually stand up to this? Well, what about the gospel? The good news that Christ has stood up on his own feet and walked out of the tomb and its all-encompassing claims of finality. Or is the gospel also subject to market forces? As a scholar of the early monastic movement, I must say that it is impossible to understand early Christian monasticism apart from the gospel. So, when John Cassian, who is required reading for those who follow the rule of St. Benedict, when he says that the end of monastic life is the kingdom of heaven, he's referring to Jesus' preaching. And when he says that the way to fulfill this end is by cultivating purity of heart, he's got the Beatitudes in mind. Because the ultimate end, the kingdom of heaven, is sought with such great desire, great effort is expended in good works and ascetic labors. There is only one condition. This effort must be expended only insofar as these practices cultivate purity of heart. Despite the necessity of good works and ascetic labors, and they are necessary, without discernment, they can actually distract from the real purpose of monastic life, anticipation of the eternal vision of God. So, practices which cultivate a recollected life of prayer take priority. Not only the Liturgy of the Hours and Lectio Divina, but also poverty, manual labor, and the works of mercy, especially hospitality, and of course, silence and solitude. This photo was taken at Mount Sinai, the God-trodden mountain, as the Orthodox like to call it. It's a place where God has revealed God's self multiple times to Moses and to Elijah. So it is no wonder monks returned there almost 1,500 years ago, seeking God. The setting itself says what Cassian says about monks in his conferences. While they are still dwelling in corruptible flesh, they set themselves this charge, in which they will abide once corruption has been laid aside, when they come to that promise of the Lord, the Savior, which says, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." This is the monastic search for God. Now, I'm not proposing that we trade the intrinsic value of this life in this world for the extrinsic value of some reward in an otherworldly existence in the next life. That would be a misunderstanding of the contemplative nature of monastic life. Cassian is clear. Monastics are to anticipate the kingdom of God while they are still dwelling in corruptible flesh, or as the Lord's Prayer puts it, on earth as it is in heaven. In fact, we're not just to pray for this, we're invited to take part in it. This is the intrinsic value of the monastic search for God, participation in the very life of God. I don't necessarily mean that we are to build the kingdom. If the Lord does not build the house, in vain do the builders labor. Rather, by making time and space for God, by crying out, "Come, Lord Jesus," with the conviction that he is coming again and soon, we will find that the kingdom of God is already being built within us. We must start with an appreciation of everything and everybody on this earth and in this cosmos as created by God. And we must acknowledge that our relationships with ourselves, with each other, with the earth, and with God are broken. And then we must seek in this life and in this world the communion to which God calls us and the transformation by which all things are brought into this communion. This is nothing more than the gospel which calls out to everyone. For monasticism, it is the pearl of great price for which everything else is renounced. Yes, monasticism is costly, but imagine the cost if nobody were to commit themselves to the gospel without compromise. Imagine the cost if we are unable to propose the gospel as the pearl of great price to the next generation. Those who try to make their life secure will lose it, but those who lose their life will keep it. I don't know if this is what Buddhism is about, but this is what Christianity is about. This is what monasticism is about. And there are no structures for this. There is only grace. So again, we're left with an ambiguity like that of this photo. St. Bernard of Clairvaux speaks of this ambiguity in the monastic's search for God as an alternation between times characterized by God's presence and times characterized by God's absence. He compares this to the lovers in the Song of Songs, how thrilling it is to be with the beloved, and how the beloved's absence only deepens one's yearning for the beloved. So, is it a sunrise or a sunset? Are we losing our lives or gaining them? Is God with us or has God withdrawn for a time? I'd like to propose that in any case, this is a hopeful ambiguity. If we must lose our lives to gain them, then even if we see the sun setting on a particular chapter of monastic history, which came to rely on the social conditions of a particular point in time, even if for a time we lose sight of the pearl of great price, we can be hopeful that the sun will rise again in the morning, our desire for God ever more intense for having been purified in the dark night. This is my whole vision for the future of monasticism. It will continue to be a movement of people who have encountered Christ and embraced the gospel as the pearl of great price for which everything else is renounced. But what might this future look like? Each community will have to discern this on their own, but let me issue a warning here, not to rely too heavily on the current structures for this discernment. Relying on the Holy Spirit means taking risks. While I appreciate the lengthy discernment processes by which communities come to a general consensus about a course of action, this can also discourage taking the risks necessary to pass along the monastic tradition to the next generation under the circumstances of our times. In fact, besides the sex abuse crisis, probably the next biggest reason I'm not currently a member of a monastic community somewhere is the lack of risk-taking that I see in monastic communities today. I'm not asking anyone to be reckless. I'm just asking that we take a bet on the gospel. Monastics have already given up everything, right? So monastics should have nothing else to lose. In this spirit, here are a few places where you might discern taking a risk. Embrace the opportunity that smaller communities offer to refocus on the intrinsic value of monastic life. Consider taking the risk of de-emphasizing the institutional aspects of the monastery and re-emphasizing the familial, domestic aspects of monastic life. Drop the security of the institutional efficiency model of religious obedience and reclaim the relational model of obedience proper to monasticism. Monastic obedience should focus on the intrinsic value of each person's search for God in the midst of a community, rather than the extrinsic value of institutional goals. I like to think about the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus at Bethany as a model for the future of monastic life. Here's a family of people with different dispositions, making sure that the work gets done and that Christ remains the one thing necessary. And there's always someone like Lazarus who needs a bit more help. Embrace new members and consider new forms of membership. Think about St. Bernard of Clairvaux. The Cistercians probably would have gone extinct if St. Bernard hadn't brought a bunch of friends and family with him to join the monastery. Are you ready to take the risk of being overrun by millennials, or does the thought make you sick? Consider how your attitudes about millennials affect their presence or lack thereof in your community. Take Benedict's advice and consult younger members. If you don't have any millennials in your community, I would still suggest trying to find some way to consult them or at least invite them to participate in your community so that you might get to know them. The idea that your retreat offerings or other programs should be tailored to the older population that you're used to seeing around the monastery is potentially deadly here. St. John's Abbey's Benedictine Volunteer Corps is a good example of a monastery inviting younger people to take part in the monastic tradition, even if only for a year. It is an intense year. After about a week of workshops at St. John's, these young men disperse to spend a year of service in monasteries around the world, in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and even New Jersey. St. Bernard's Cistercian order can also be credited with taking the risk of embracing a new form of membership in the lay brother. The increase in oblates suggests that alternative forms of membership may be part of the future of monasticism. St. Gertrude's co-housing initiative, which invites single women to take up residence at the monastery, is one example of what this might look like. And the Trappists at St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, have made it known that they are willing to invite claustral oblates to live in the monastery with them without vows. Consider the future of your facilities. Can you continue to live in them sustainably? Or do you need to find new uses for them, or even hand them over to another group that can make better use of them? In response to the environmental crisis, renovations and new construction should prioritize sustainability. I would go even further than conventional sustainable architecture and suggest making use of natural building methods whenever possible, as natural built structures are not only sustainable, but also beautiful, simple, and allow for a lot of participation in their construction by the people who will inhabit them. In this way, natural building methods incarnate many of the values of monastic life. The Monastery of Christ in the Desert provides a good example here. This photo shows the straw bales, which serve as insulation for their monastic cells. You can read more in the Sustainable Stewardship section of their website, which I happen to have had a hand in writing and editing. Consider renewing eremitic life and spirituality in response to the environmental crisis. The word eremos, from which we get the words eremitic, hermit, and hermitage, is often translated desert, but I really think wilderness is a better translation. In contrast to back to the land movements, which value the land primarily for its potential to offer self-sufficiency, the wilderness spirituality of the early desert fathers and mothers emphasizes our dependence on God made apparent in wild places. Perhaps we need this risk-taking spirituality to inform the risk-taking we must embrace for the future of monasticism. As a former wilderness therapy guide, I have a lot of ideas about what a contemporary wilderness spirituality might look like, and I'm hoping to find ways to share these ideas with others in the near future. These are just a few places where existing monastic communities can begin responding to the signs of the times. Entirely new communities might also provide good ways to respond to the signs of the times, especially if they're able to maintain a vital connection with existing monastic communities. This would provide opportunities for ecumenical monasteries, communities which include both men and women, and other initiatives which currently don't have a place in the canonical structures of the Roman Catholic Church. I'll put a couple links in the description to ideas I have about what completely new monastic communities might look like. What you'll see here should look somewhat familiar to you after listening to this presentation, but please don't get caught up in some of the details I've included here to make it a little easier to imagine the future of monasticism. I'll say it again. My whole vision for the future of monasticism is that it will continue to be a movement of people who have encountered Christ and embraced the gospel as the pearl of great price for which everything else is renounced. I might just add that this pearl of great price might even require renouncing some of what we fell in love with about the monastic structures of a previous era. So, even if you see the sun setting, there is hope that it will rise again in the morning. And if you see the sun rising, I implore you to take the risk of chasing it all the way to the kingdom of heaven. If you've made it this far in the video, something I said must have resonated with you. So if you think there might be a place for me in your monastery, or if you're sitting there thinking, if this is the future of monasticism, I want to be a part of it, please comment below and subscribe to this channel. I'm open to constructive criticism too, so let's continue the conversation. Take care, everyone.